In this video tutorial, we will be learning about the grid system in AutoCAD. The grid system can be accessed a number of ways. You can type grid at the command prompt, and then you get all these options. You don't quite get them all, but you get a lot of them. Okay. So if I wanted to turn the grid on, I could do it right there. If I wanted to turn it off, same thing. I hit the space bar to bring the command back up. But that's not how I typically do it. I typically go down to this area right here, which is my status bar, and I click on Snap Settings, which is really the drafting settings, and I go to the Grid Snap, or the Snap Grid tab. We're going to focus first on the grid. We'll talk about Snap in a minute, but as you can see, the grid is on, and it's check mark showing it's on. We can also turn it off right here, but it won't show that it's off until I click out of it. So I'm going to turn it back on. You can see it's back on. I'll go back into my settings. Now a little bit about the grid. The grid, though you can see it on the screen, is not something that prints. The grid is there just for reference. It doesn't print, doesn't show up in a drawing. It's just a background set of lines that are used as a reference point. Here's how I use them as a teacher teaching AutoCAD. I have my students set up and turn on the grid, and I also have them set their limits, even though you don't need limits printing from paper space, because when the grid is on and the limits are set, it immediately gives the student an awareness of a couple things. First, when I draw the object, does the object fit in the world I'm drawing it in? Secondly, if it does fit, is the object tiny in the world I've created, or is it filling the whole space? So it gives a reference point back to, are my limits correct? Because if my limits aren't correct, it also means my scale factor is not correct. So by turning on the grid and setting the limits, it aids a student learning how to use AutoCAD. It aids them in understanding, have I set my drawing environment up properly? That's really what we use the grid for. So let's talk about the grid now. We have a couple of options here in the grid. The first one is the grid style. None of them are checked. If I click on 2D model space and click OK, you may not be able to see it very well, but I have these red dots on the screen. They're red because my cursor is red. I have my cursor red just for some technical reasons in light of what we do here at the school. Yours does not need to be, but you can see a little red dot right there. There's other ones right there. That's one option, or that's one way to have your grid set up. Let's see if sheet layout changes it. Sheet layout goes back to that, and I think the block editor looks just like sheet layout, yeah. So we really don't need any of those clicked, because two of them give us what we have here. The other model space gives you just the dots, and the dots aren't as easy to see. The next section is grid spacing. This is the X spacing and this is the Y spacing. AutoCAD defaults to this. I never change this. I leave it the same unless I'm using a scale factor that is not 1. Because if I'm using, let's say, a scale factor of, I don't know, let's say 196, that means I'm drawing a fairly large drawing. I will not be able to see an X and Y spacing of 0.5 when I have zoomed out to see the whole electronic environment I've set up if I'm using a scale factor of 196. AutoCAD used to say grid is too dense to display. I don't think it does that anymore, but that's something it used to do. Now you just don't see the grid. So we leave these as is unless we're using a scale factor greater than 1, and then we multiply 0.5 times the scale factor. So if I had a scale factor of 48 times 0.5, I would enter 24 right here. I leave every major line at 5. Now here are two other things that are checked in the grid, which I have new students uncheck. I have them uncheck the adaptive grid because I don't want the grid changing on its own, and I also uncheck display beyond grid limits. The reason I uncheck display beyond grid limits is for this reason. The grid is one of those areas you can use to check to see, do I have my environment set up properly? For instance, if I uncheck grid display beyond limits, now the grid is only as large as my limits. If I turn my limits on, my electronic environment is 12 by 9. If that is the correct electronic environment setting, and I have my grid, or excuse me, if that 12 by 9 is incorrect, and I have my display beyond limits checked, now the grid goes beyond the 12 by 9 limits, and I can't tell if the object I'm trying to draw fits inside the electronic environment, or if the electronic environment is too big or too small. I will give you an example of that right now. So if I go up here and I create a rectangle, and this is the actual size the rectangle is supposed to be. If the student has gone through the process of setting up their grid correctly, and they've set up their limits, I can tell right away my limits or their limits are not correct because the object doesn't fit inside the electronic environment. It's too big. But if I have my grid display beyond limits checked, you can't tell that. So even though most people aren't printing from paper or model space anymore, there are companies that do still, and because it aids in how the student sets up the electronic environment, it is a prompt that will warn them something is not right. So if we go back in here and turn that off, that tells me something's right. So there are still companies that are printing from model space, which means you have to set your limits correctly. And because when students are just learning how to use AutoCAD and set up one of the problems that they have to do, or one of the tasks they have to do is set up an electronic environment, having the grid displayed beyond limits turned off alerts the student immediately to something isn't right in their setup, because their rectangle that is created the right size is bigger than the electronic environment, so they need to change something there. Or they can check and see, is my rectangle the correct size? Maybe it's not, because my limits are showing me something isn't right. So it jogs their memory right away with, maybe I haven't done something correctly. The other thing, right now the grid is set up to a rectangular. I can set the grid to isometric, and as you can see now, the grid is at an isometric angle. F5 moves me through my 3 isometric planes. There's my front plane, my top plane, my right side plane. Won't use that though unless you're doing isometric drawing, so I'll put it back to rectangular. The last thing we want to look at is your snap option. The snap option is off. It has the exact same X and Y spacing that the grid does, and it can be changed. I can make them equal or not. And then with snap on, you can't tell the snap is on until I go into a drawing tool. And once I do that, notice how my cursor only moves to an intersection of the grid. It's forcing me to snap to the intersection or intersections of the grid. That's what snap does for me. I don't use snap very often, but it's very helpful sometimes. So that's what snap does. Let me turn the snap back off. So that is how you can set up your grid in a way that is advantageous for the new learner, and those are the options found in the grid as well as the snap tool.